Why is it imperative to get rid of worldly attachments? We often hear from great philosophers and gurus and in the great texts that attachment itself is a type of obstacle on the spiritual path. And we hear this throughout all the texts, as I mentioned, and no more so than in the Ashtavakra Gita. Ashtavakra himself actually goes in depth as to why attachments are an obstacle on the spiritual path. And I want to read to you today a very important verse on why we should overcome worldly attachments. He who has given up worldly attachment from his mind, who is beyond the pairs of opposites, and who is free from desire, to him no experience coming as a matter of course causes either pleasure or pain. So Ashtavakra is alluding to here that when we live in that duality, in those pairs of opposites, that's what causes attachment. And then as a consequence, we either experience pleasure or pain. But if you're like Ashtavakra and you overcome those desires, then you are not then a hostage of either of the pairs of opposites in the world. And so this is why we should eliminate worldly attachment according to the Ashtavakra Gita. And so we need to understand that the essence of the one who is attracted to worldly attachment is the jiva, is the ego persona system, right? It is that limited individual that we believe we are, this limited subjectivity that is attracted to all of these worldly attachments, because in itself the jiva is operating from a dualistic place, and so there can only be this or that. And so we are not free from desire when we're living through that limited individual, right? But who we truly are is the Atman, is the undifferentiated consciousness, which is identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. But from that place, how could any desire arise from the undifferentiated state of consciousness? Because you are whole and complete in itself. So there is nothing to add nor subtract. That only applies to the limited individual. There's usually something to add or subtract when we think of ourselves and we try to curate our own self-image. But once you have down-regulated that self-image and you abide as the Atman, how could any attachment ever arise? Why would you be attached to anything, right? That would not exist because you no longer exist in the pairs of opposites. So when you begin to abide in that ultimate state, you then are not a victim of the objects of experience, right? So we often are a victim of the objects of experience because we're operating from the jiva and we're in the world of this and that, of the pairs, right? Hot and cold and so forth and so on. And so we're constantly analyzing our world around us based on these objects of experience, not just in the external world too, also in the internal world, right? We have objects of knowledge in our mind that dissects the world up into this and that's how you begin to frame the world, right? And so you're a constant victim of the objects of experience. And so our understanding of what is pleasurable or painful comes from the contact with our senses, right? And so that's how we begin to frame the world, through our senses. And so we then think of whatever is pleasure-giving or pain-giving, and that's all based on the sensory world. And so as a result, we begin to desire what is pleasure-giving as opposed to pain-giving, right? And so we have this dichotomy where we will try our hardest to abide with what is pleasurable and then do our damnedest to avoid what we believe is painful. But Ashtavakara's point in this verse is that if we don't feel an attraction or repulsion to either of the pairs of opposites, they cannot produce any pleasurable or painful sensations, right? Because you are beyond that. You abide in the Atman. And so you're operating from the non-dual state of consciousness. And so you don't have an attraction nor a repulsion for what is arising in the field of your own consciousness, right? You don't have a desire for the objects of experience. And so you're not either or, you're just completely whole, right? And so you're not consumed by what is pleasurable and what is painful. And so then you don't develop a view of the world of what you hate and what you enjoy, right? And so this goes on to a subtle level too, and into an ideological level. This becomes psychological, where people begin to then portray whatever they align with and whatever bias they have with in maybe the political sphere, right? And so they build the whole ethos of their consciousness around that. And anything different that comes into their field of consciousness, they get triggered, they have an outburst, they deny it, they avoid it as much as possible, and so forth and so on, right? And so it goes on all layers, this. But Ashtavakra is saying that if you don't have an attraction nor a repulsion for the objects of experience, how can you be consumed with desire for anything, right? Because you are beyond desire, and as a result, you have no worldly attachments. You now are above that. And that's what Ashtavakra is trying to teach in the Avadhuta Gita in many verses, that we need to rise above this individualistic, subjective jiva desire and abide as the ultimate Atman. So then we will never have desire for anything, and so then we will never be consumed by worldly attachment. Shanti, shanti, shanti.